I'm here this evening to talk about the book Morality, which tragically, sadly, was the last book to be written by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory. It is so sad to even think of Rabbi Sacks in the past tense. And yet here we are. We do not know the years and days that are allotted in our lives. And as such, here was a person who made the most of his. This is the book that I will be reviewing this evening. I don't know if you had a chance to read it. I know a few of you did. And Morality, subtitled Restoring the Common Good in Divided Times. In the Jewish tradition, we have a concept which is referred to as an ethical will. And unlike certain wills where we are familiar typically where money is involved and an individual will bequeath money to his children, to his estate, to charitable organizations, an ethical will speaks of passing on not one's financial capacity and resources to the next generation, but actually it passes on one's ethics, one's thoughts, one's knowledge and wisdom that they have acquired over the course of their lifetime. And they hand this on to their descendants and their children in a way in which they say, this is how I would like you to live your life now that I will no longer be here. I think in many ways, this book is Rabbi Sacks's ethical will that he leaves us with. And why did he write this book? He writes this book and he says so in the first page. He says that I have written this book and dedicated it to my 9 grandchildren, and it was for the sake of their future that I write this book. I guess in a way we have all become his extended grandchildren, if I can say that. And he says that this is his message and what has now become his final message to all anxious citizens who care about liberal democracy. This book was published in Britain just under a year ago in April, right as the coronavirus was coming to the shores of England. It was then released in North America September 1st. And on October 15th, his office announced via Twitter that he was being treated for cancer. And already 3 weeks later, November 7th, he died in London at the age of 72. This book can almost be seen as a summation of his life's work. And he says again in his introduction, I'm quoting now, societal freedom cannot be sustained by market economies and liberal democratic politics alone. He will juxtapose 2 of the great systems of the liberal democracy in which we work in, the state on the one hand, government, the seats of laws, and the market economy on the other. And he says that we have outsourced society to these 2 great institutions. Government tells us what we are allowed to do and the limits of our power. And the state teaches us, and the market teaches us what we can purchase and how much we can sell whatever it is we are going to sell for. He says, you will not be able to build a society without the 3rd element in between. And that 3rd element in between, he calls morality. What is his definition of morality? Again, this is all from his introduction. What he will define as morality is a concern for the welfare of others, an active commitment to justice and compassion, a willingness to ask not just what is good for me, but what is good for all of us together. It's about us, not me. And he frames this with a phrase that he will come back to again and again and again throughout the book. Can we move from the we, can we move from the I, can we move from the I to the we? And this is the essence of his book. And what Rabbi Sacks does in the way that is so classically him is he creates a metaphor for the erosion of the social fabric, the bonds that connect all of us together in society. And it's through this metaphor that he is able to paint his picture. One of Rabbi Sacks's great geniuses was being able to communicate and get across complicated, deep ideas in a way that was simple, in a way that was easy to understand. And in the beginning section of this book, he will use the metaphor of a phrase I believe he himself coined: cultural climate change. Have you heard this expression before? Cultural climate change. And so, what is cultural climate change? Well, what is climate change? We know that climate change has been, it's actually a variety of factors, but the heating up of the Earth. Climate change, planet Earth is getting warmer. Now, it only needs to be the slightest of degree in order for it to get warmer, and you will have the polar ice caps starting to melt. And so on and so forth. That trickle effect creates an incredible change within all of society and all of the world. What is cultural climate change? Rabbi Sacks wants to argue that the way in which society is currently headed, we are in for a disaster. And just as climate change needs to be averted before it's too late, so too cultural climate change, society, the world in which we live in, needs to come to a significant pivot and change of direction before it's too late. And what does before it's too late mean? Before we lose the liberal democracies of the West. His writing specifically, United Kingdom, Britain, and America, but he's referring to all liberal Western democracies. And in a chilling way, and this is a word that you're going to hear me repeat over and over again tonight, in a chilling fashion, he contrasts the end of the Roman Empire and the end of the Greek Empire. And he says that these were some of the greatest empires that ruled the known world. And yet they lost and were defeated by barbarians that had a lower level of civilization than they did, but a greater sense of togetherness that ultimately led to them overthrowing the current leading civilization of the world, be it Rome or Greece. What does cultural climate change look like? I want to share with you what I believe to be the top 4 presentations of how Rabbi Sacks creates this picture. Number 1, a loss of trust in politicians and big corporations. Let me ask you a question. You don't have to answer publicly. Do you trust, by and large, politicians today? Do you trust, by and large, the multinational corporations? Do we trust big business? You know what was the example of our lack of trust? It's changed. Amazingly, by the miracles of this vaccine, it's changed. People are praising and thanking Pfizer, Moderna. But a number of years ago, and I'm not going back so long, maybe 3-4 years ago, there was a CEO of one of the big pharmaceutical corporations put in front of a Senate panel in the United States for charging excessive amounts of money for essential drugs and services that his company had a monopoly over. And these were cancer drugs. And when the senators of America were saying, do you really think it's justified to be charging such overly inflated prices? The CEO started smirking. Do you remember this? You can Google it. It is one of those, your skin crawls at that point. And the CEO starts smirking. And he says, I'm afraid I'm going to pledge my allegiance to the fifth, and I'm not going to answer that question. And each time he comes back to that same one. There was the big bad boy of multinational corporations not so long ago. It was big pharma, pharmaceutical corporations. That's changed, Baruch Hashem. But number one is a loss of trust in the political system, politicians themselves. Number two, the loss of personal happiness. Rabbi Sachs will, chapter at a time, give an incredible overview of the state of human flourishing and thriving economically in 2021. Never have we been richer. And yet emotionally, never have we been poorer. And he will show us an indication of our emotional poverty, the massive rise in drug abuse and in substance abuse by teenagers in the West. That's indicator number one. And the statistics are frightening. Indicator number two, depression. There have never been such record levels of depression in the West than there are today, at a time when we have more leisure time, a time when we have more disposable income, a time when we're living longer, when we have access to medications. Everything as an indicator shows that life is getting better. What is the response? We're on the psychologist's couch seeking therapy. And if that's not bad enough, the third indication of loss of personal happiness is what Jean Twenge calls iGen. Spoken about this a number of times over the last number of years. I want to thank Gail, who's on the call this evening, for bringing to my attention the book iGen, although Rabbi Sachs beat you to it a number of years ago as well. Jean Twenge is a researcher, a psychological social researcher in California. And she writes a book about millennials. You may have heard about those people. And they are scared. They are anxious. These are individuals who are timid. They're people who have grown up with a cellular device in their hands, and as a result have not been able to spread their wings and experience the world in all of its depth. This is loss of personal happiness. And Rabbi Sachs points out that at any given point, in any month, in any year, in recent times, go to the New York Times top 10 books, and the majority of them, nonfiction, the majority of them will be self-help books. What are we reading? Self-help books. Face the fear and do it anyway. The power of now. Stay still and get going. Who Moved My Cheese? Self-help books are the books that we are reading. That's the second indicator of cultural climate change. Number 3, the economics of inequality. Has anyone heard of Bob Iger? Does anyone know that name? Have you heard the name Bob Iger? Saul's nodding. Saul is such a well-read individual. Nothing gets past you, Saul. You're amazing. Bob Iger is the CEO of a small company. You may have heard of the company. It's called Walt Disney Incorporated. Have you heard of Disney? Bob Iger, CEO of Disney, in 2018, received as his payment for the year, take a guess. What did Bob Iger, CEO of Disney, pay himself? He's the CEO, remember? Let me hear if you're close or low, too high. $65.6 million. That's more than I make in 3 years. Bob Iger, CEO of Disney, paid himself $65.6 million. I want to share with you a statistic. If you take the median pay of a Disney worker, Bob Iger was paid 1,424 times as much as the median pay of an average Disney worker. There has been an incredible disparity over these last 10, 20, 30 years of CEOs paying themselves exorbitant amounts. And what was once a ratio of 1 to 20 a number of years ago, from a CEO pay to the median pay of an employee, jumped now at sometimes 1 to 1,000. Bob Iger's 1,400 is an extreme example of this. And as much as the rich have been getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. The economics of inequality. And number 4, the assault on free speech. Now, these 4 expressions are so prescient because since the book was written, there have been example after example of these classic 4 indicators of cultural climate change. I don't need to share with you, I'm sure you are aware of J.K. Rowling, who's an exceptional person, the author of Harry Potter books. She is an exceptional human being. And she put out a tweet, and it wasn't appreciated by the liberal orthodoxy of British media. And she was what we call now cancelled. There is something in society called cancel culture, where individuals with stellar reputations who have done greatness for humankind in society, if they are seen to be veering from the accepted media party line, then they are simply cancelled. The assault on free speech, Rabbi Sachs points out, is especially true and poignant at universities. And he bemoans this point because he reflects back on his own university experience and how rich an experience it was in the pursuit of truth, and how as a religious student, some of his professors at Cambridge were some of the greatest atheists in England at the time, and yet they never challenged his own personal beliefs. They simply rigorously educate him in terms of how to think and articulate philosophical positions. Today, universities have been turned into a battleground, primarily of victimhood, where the victims shout so loudly. And if you are not seen to be on the right side of the trend, you are cancelled. You are not given an opportunity to speak. You are uninvited. These are, how are we doing for time? Oh my gosh, I'm only at the beginning. I'm already at 8:30. Now, we started a little late, but thank you for being with me for the next 3 hours. I really appreciate that. God bless you all. But this is my introduction. So far, so good? You're with me? Okay, great. Let's continue. I'm going to skip. I've made notes. I'm skipping my notes. I'm skipping. Right. What was fascinating to me was how Rabbi Sachs is actually aware of the audience that he's writing for. Here is a religious thinker. Here's a Jewish thinker writing for a British and American audience, the vast majority of which is secular and at best open to religiosity, at worst suspicious and hostile to it. And here comes a religious thinker, and he says, I would like to speak about morality. And I'm quoting again from his preface. This is a quote, the contemporary world, I can share this if you like. Let me share this with you so you can read the quote. See if I mess myself up. Okay, do you see that? The contemporary world has given morality a rough ride. The word itself now evokes all we distrust most: the intrusion of impersonal standards into our private lives, the presence of judgment where judgment does not belong, the substitution of authority for choice. When a politician moralizes, we suspect that he or she is searching for an excuse not to pay for something. When a religious leader moralizes, we fear the imposition of certainties we no longer share. And we suspect that fundamentalism is not far behind. When a particularly newsworthy crime or social trend provokes ethical debate, it will not be long before voices are heard dismissing the conversation as moral panic. We have come to share George Bernard Shaw's conviction that morality is one person's way of disrupting someone else's innocent enjoyment, or as H.G. Wells called it, jealousy with a halo. Fabulous passage. Fabulous passage. Why do I share that with you? Because, and this is one of the most amazing things about the book itself, Rabbi Sachs is writing for a secular audience. And he realizes, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Give me a chance. I realize I'm a religious thinker. I realize I'm talking about morality now. But don't give the same cynicism that you would to the general sense of how we roll our eyes when people start speaking about morality. And what I found so incredible about certain passages in this book, and it's classic Sachs, is his command of the historical sweep of intellectual thought. In one chapter titled Human Dignity, for example, he moves from Copernicus to Newton to Spinoza to Marx to Darwin to Freud to the neo-Darwinians in just 2 short, brisk pages that are as readable as they are understandable. I want you to know, having studied philosophy myself at university, there is nothing as dense and as complicated and as confusing as philosophy. The worst people to have conversations with are philosophers. You don't understand what they're trying to say. Never mind think about arguing with them. So what do you think about my proposition? That was a proposition? You just spoke for 20 minutes. I don't even know what you said. Philosophy is dense, philosophy is hard, philosophy is complicated. And yet somehow or other, and I'm going to show an example of this towards the end, Rabbi Sachs is able to take the essence of an idea and bring it into the simplest of language. And this is his talent, this is his strength, this was his greatness. And chapter by chapter, what Rabbi Sachs will do will spell out the implications of the problems. We no longer live in a world where truth is respected. We live in a post-truth world. We now no longer have safe spaces because of microaggressions. We now live in a world of victimhood. We now live in a world of public shaming. We live in a world without civility anymore. We live in a world of unsocial media. We live in a world where we're depressed. We live in a world where we need self-help. We live in a world, in a word, where we are lonely. I just read out the titles of the first 12 chapters of this book. And I have to tell you, and there were moments when I was reading this, and Sarah would be in the room with me at the time when I was reading it, and I'd be like, oh my God, I can't, oh, that's devastating. She'd be like, what? And it makes for depressing reading. To look at the state of society and to look at the world of the West today, we are in trouble. This was not easy reading from the perspective of it being a happy-go-lucky, rose-colored approach to the world in which we live in. And Rabbi Sachs's argument is we need to stop thinking of ourselves. There needs to be less I and more we. And this is the crux of his argument. He will paint how we fell into such an individualistic society that was, in his mind, propelled in the 1960s and has become quicker and quicker in its pace leading up to today. What were the philosophical underpinnings that led to an individualistic society? He will pair two thinkers in making his point. Throughout the book, he will pair the Danish Christian existentialist philosopher Soren Kierkegaard with the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And in comparing and contrasting these two great philosophers, he will say that morality stopped being something out there and instead became something in here. We can do what we want now, as long as we don't harm others or harm ourselves, we can do what we want. Allow me to read just a couple of passages as how he lays out this philosophical journey that led to the birth of the individual. And he says that what comes with the birth of the individual and the selfishness contained within only thinking about me is the loss of a shared communal ethic of thinking about us, all of us together. He says as follows, again, another quote, lose morality and eventually you lose liberty. That was received wisdom for centuries. How did it change? It began with relatively abstract ideas. There was a long period of reflection on the nature of the individual and the self, starting with the Reformation, continuing through the Enlightenment, and culminating in the 19th century radicalism of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. Allow me to read two paragraphs now. What he does, I don't know if anyone could do. He will spend one paragraph on Kierkegaard, one paragraph on Nietzsche, and summarize their entire philosophy in 4 sentences. If you've never read any Kierkegaard and never read any Nietzsche, you will learn everything about who they were and what they believed in just the following 4 sentences. We start with Kierkegaard. In a dazzling and wholly original work titled Either or, Kierkegaard sets out in the form of 2 persona, 2 radically different models of existence. The aesthetic, with its life of the senses and the ethical, with its life of the senses, and the ethical, with its commitment to righteousness and duty. These constitute two different worlds of feeling and thinking. They amount to two different lives. Each is coherent and consistent in itself, but radically incompatible with the other. Which then to choose? There are no criteria by which you could make a rational choice. All you could do was decide non-rationally. You had to make a leap of faith. Not all values can be realized in a single life. The Platonic idea of the harmony of the true, the good, and the beautiful had been exploded beyond repair. In placing at the center of the moral life this essentially non-rational choice, not of what to do, but of who to be. Did you follow that? It's incredible. Kierkegaard will come along and present us with an approach that says, we used to be told how to behave, but now we're being told that rationally, there's no reason that we should behave one way or another. It's a choice. It's up to us. And we are the center of that choice. Thus far, Kierkegaard. Now let's go on to Nietzsche. Again, Rabbi Sachs's words. Nietzsche was the first to proclaim that God is dead and we have killed him. So radical was the assertion that he put it into the mouth of an imagined madman in his book, quote, The Gay Science. But he was far from more than merely an atheist. His view was that the entire Judeo-Christian moral heritage was nothing less than the revenge of the powerless against the powerful, the retribution exacted by slaves against their former masters. It was a sustained exercise in ressentiment. Everything we had come to think of as virtue, compassion, kindness, was in fact a way of caging, neutering the reality of human nature, which was, he believed, shaped and dominated by the will to power. In this point in the book, Rabbi Sachs is arguing that the philosophy of Nietzsche turned morality on its head, and that there no longer was a God, because all morals were actually a rebellion of the powerless against the ruling classes. And no longer was morality an obligation, but it was a personal choice. In the world at large, one thing and one thing only mattered, and that was, how powerful can you be? Because if you can assert yourself over others, you win. How deeply we have seen this to be true in modern politics in the West. And Rabbi Sachs will speak about the rise of populism, how there are leaders now without even being politicians. My favorite is the Ukraine. I'm sure you've been following that story over the last 2 years. What does, obviously he's a Jewish boy, which just makes it all the more, what does a Jewish boy in the Ukraine, who's an actor, playing in a TV series do after he's famous? Well, what did this Jewish boy do? He played on TV in a comedy series in the Ukraine. A person who was a school teacher, who with no background, no training, and no engagement or involvement in politics, decides to run as president of the country. And yes, believe it or not, he ends up winning. This is a comedy TV show in the Ukraine. After the series finished, what did the actor go and do? This is art imitating life, imitating art. The actor decided, with no training and with no background and with no knowledge of politics, this comedian decided to enter politics, and lo and behold, he won and is today the president of the Ukraine. These are the political leaders. And that was popularism taken to an extreme. What about popularism when you're a bully? What about popularism when you can strong arm individuals? What about popularism when you're able to simply shout over and louder than any of your competitors? Let's listen to Rabbi Sacks's conclusion. He's now presented Kierkegaard, he's presented Nietzsche. Again, what does 19th century philosophy have to do with 2021 and my choice of what Amazon gift I'm going to buy myself or what self-help book I'm in the middle of reading? Here he comes. Again, Rabbi Sacks, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, between them, effectively destroyed the foundations of morality as they had been known in the West for many centuries, and each proposed in its place a profoundly personal, subjective vision of the moral life, in which choice was of the essence. Not choice as it had always been known between good and evil, as defined by the prevailing culture, but rather to define good and evil themselves in an act involving the totality of one's being. The I had become not just the principal character in the moral drama, but its author and the writer of its rules. Now, I'd like to point out here something which is a statement in the Talmud. We know that the Talmud, nearly every single page of Talmud, is an argument between rabbis. And there were two great schools in the era of the Talmud, Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. The house of Hillel and the house of Shammai. And they argue all over the Talmud. How do we rule? We actually rule in accordance with Beit Hillel. And the Talmud asks the question, why is that? Why do we rule in accordance with Beit Hillel? And the Talmud gives a fabulous answer. Because they were gentle in their approach. And not only were they gentle in their approach and humble, but they also made sure they gave the due respect to the views of their opponents as well. And not only did they give the due respect to their opponents, but they would teach their opponents' views before they would even teach their own. And for that humility and for that graciousness, Jewish law, halacha, is decided in accordance with Beit Hillel and not Beit Shammai. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever encountered somebody in a debate recently where they can articulate both sides of the equation? Have you ever spoken or met or discussed or argued with somebody that had such humility and graciousness that they are able to listen to you with such an active listening that they would potentially be prepared to change their mind if you were able to rationally convince them of your point of view? It doesn't happen very often. It doesn't happen very often at all. We live in a world of sound bites. We live in a world where we bulldoze our opinions across any playing field that we can to get our point across and to win the argument. One of the most beautiful things that I noticed in reading this book is that Rabbi Sacks, of course, disagrees with Kierkegaard, of course, disagrees with Nietzsche, but he affords them the most incredible respect in presenting their opinions, and even presenting their opinions first, only to then disagree with them. In the vein of Beit Hillel themselves, Rabbi Sacks was able to show his opponent's opinions, and with grace, then disagree. I'd like to move on now, as I see that we are running out of time, unfortunately. And I want to share with you, we'll move into questions. I see there's a few questions as well. I'd like to share with you, well, what are we supposed to do? How do we move forwards? What's the solution? It's one thing to paint an accurate picture of the problem, but how do we now go forwards. And it was here that I found, unfortunately, and I don't want to say this as a criticism because who am I to criticize Rabbi Sacks, but it was here that I found that this is where the book needed more. A quote by Rabbi Sacks: to begin to make a difference, all we need to do is change ourselves, to act morally, to be concerned with the welfare of others, to be someone people trust, to give, to volunteer, to listen, to smile, to be sensitive, generous, caring. That is absolutely true, and it's beautiful, and in his classic way, articulated as only he can. And yet, where do we go from here? One of the great books of Jewish philosophy in the early modern period was called Mesilat Yesharim, translated into English as The Path of the Just. And in this book of ethical practice, the author writes in his introduction, I haven't come here to tell you anything you don't already know. Indeed, if you read this book, you'll not see anything in it that you didn't already know. But rather, the benefit of this book is reading it and rereading it again and again and again to familiarize ourselves and to keep at the very forefront of our minds these lessons. Because, and here is his line, to the degree in which we are more familiar with an idea, so to that same degree, we are more casual and forgetful in putting into practice what it is we already believe. It's a fascinating line. I'll say it again, to the degree that we are familiar with how we should behave, we are equally to the same degree absent-minded in putting our thoughts into action. What Rabbi Sacks leaves us with at the end of the book is, yes, a call to action. How do we fix a broken world? How can we fix a society that is fractured, that is splitting apart at the seams? Is this the end of Western liberal democracies? Is this the end of societies as we know them? And Rabbi Sacks says, let's be more sensitive. Let's be more caring. Let's be more generous. Let people have trust in us. Let us listen to people. Let us smile at people. The truth is, I don't have a different answer. I really don't. And this is his conclusion. Let us be better people. And if we can, then one person at a time, one day at a time, one life at a time, we will together change a world and heal that fractured society. This is some thoughts on the book, Morality, Restoring the Common Good in Divided Times. Obviously, in the short time that I spent with you, it was the tip of the iceberg, but I would like you to read it if you haven't already. Maybe you did in anticipation of tonight's book review, but it makes for fabulous reading, depressing reading, I must admit. But at the end of the day, we are left with, as I started, Rabbi Sacks's ethical will. I believe this book will transcend his grandchildren to whom it was written for and actually inspire all who come to read it at this extremely difficult time in the history of the West. And hopefully all who do read it can put its message into practice, and we will come away with an enhanced sense of human solidarity, responsibility, morality, and ultimately love. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes, Riva. I'm going to ask you, hang on, I think I can unmute you. Can I unmute you, Riva? I can ask you to unmute yourself. Yes, Riva.
Okay. I did want to mention that the rabbi used we, I, going towards we. And as I was reading the book, I was reading Time magazine, And Rabbi Sachs referred to the power of we and talked about Robert D. Putnam and Garrett, correct?
Yes.
And this was the article, The Power of We.
Amazing.
And isn't that amazing? As I was reading this book, the unprecedented political polarization, deep and accelerating equality. And they do mention that we've been here before, that the Gilded Age of the late 1800s was very much like today. And as you mentioned, well, America was highly individualistic at that time. But during the 1960s, we turned sharply back to I and the self-help groups and so forth. Now, we were saved because we did have some excellent political leaders like Teddy Roosevelt, and the leaders of the time helped us do this. But it finishes off by saying that it's controlled by our choices that we also make personally. We can't just depend
Absolutely.
on the political situation. So I wanted to share this with you because I thought that it was an interesting article.
Fascinating. Robert Putnam is quoted extensively in the book Morality. And I thank you for that. Excellent comment. Yes, somebody else. If anyone else has something. Yes, Leslie. If you can unmute yourself.
Hi. You're quite right. This is the second book by Rabbi Sachs that I read, and the first one was depressing as well. And he did leave at the end an absence of suggestions. One, I hope that through his wisdom, his knowledge, he would be able to at least point a direction. It seems to me that the people who should be reading this are our political and economic leaders, because of the disintegration of so many important features of Western democracies these days, and we see it, we watch it on TV, and it's very current right now. It's hard to get people to appreciate what we can do if they're so invested in the I part of getting done what they want done for themselves. And there are so many open issues. It's sort of difficult for a group of 20 people to come up with an idea of this is what has to be done. It's more like who should be inspired by reading Rabbi Sachs's book. And I think it was clear to me that it really is, it's not written by a Jewish sage for other Jews. It's written by a very bright and devoted and moral person for other people, any other people, all other people.
Yes, this is his call to secular society to come together.
Yes.
Away from the selfishness that is one of the byproducts of the modern period in which we live in. Absolutely. Thank you. Izzy, yes. You'll have to unmute yourself first.
I think one of the key issues, there were many key issues, but one of the key issues that I picked up on is when Rabbi Sachs talks about if you stop communicating, you will have war. And I think the beauty of that is that by continuing to communicate, you're accepting the fact that someone else has a voice.
Excellent point. One of the things, I didn't dwell on this, thank you for bringing this up. I didn't dwell on this, but one of the points that he does spend a lengthy period of time on is how social media and the news feeds that we look at and read are narrowcasting our opinions. There used to be something called broadcasting, but now we read the news that agrees with our sensitivities. We read updates that bolster and further our biases and our own preconceived notions of what we think we want to see. And as a result of that, we leave very little room for people with differences of opinion other than us. Such an important point. And of course, with the loss of being able to discuss and to debate with others who disagree with us, we form ourselves into our own groups of us against them, which is really the beginning of the end for a cohesive, unified society. Thank you, very important point. Yes, Dr. Tannenbaum, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, am I up? Okay, so there are two things that I'm left with. There's so many things. He's got tremendous insight, but I'd like to speak about his insight and one part, and another thing about his solution. In terms of his insight, at some point he talks about people that are anywhere and somewhere. You know, the somewhere are the people, the rural countries. They have a home. They don't move. They're there. They have no way to get out. They've lost their jobs. Their jobs have been sent elsewhere. And these are the people that are somewhere. They're fixed. And then you have the anywhere person. So the people that live in their cities. They're the elite, the professionals, the CEOs. They can pick up, they can go. And the people that are somewhere, they're so jealous of them. They can't move. They can't go anywhere. They don't have any money or anything like that. And this gives rise to what we're seeing today in the populism. And I just want to read one sentence that is so appropriate to what's happening this week. And he talks about populism. And I'm going to read a paragraph. Populism politics involves magical thinking, the belief that a strong leader with contempt for the democratic process, divisive rhetoric, relaxed about the truth or otherwise of his or her utterances, ignoring the conventions of normal politics, appealing directly to the people, blaming the State of the Union or some subgroup of the nation, or perhaps neighboring nations of the people, and speaking not to the better angels of our nature, but to the worst, can restore a nation's former greatness. And that's magical thinking. And this is what we're having in the United States. He predicted what we have seen this week. And it's all there. So that's sort of where we are. But how do we get out of this? What is our solution, if you like? And I liked his contrast between the terms a contract and a covenant. And throughout his reading, he always talks about a covenant. Right. And he says a contract, it's a transaction. You know, I give you a contract, build a house, it's a transaction. There's no feelings, there's nothing. It's strictly dollars and cents. But a covenant is a relationship. A contract is about interest. A covenant is about that's why contract are benefits, but covenants transform. And throughout his writings, when he talks about the covenants with people, with Hashem, or the covenants, it's a relationship. And when he's talking about going from the I to the we, he's talking about relationships. And you just have to bond, and you have to have respect for the other person.
And I think that's the heart of this, the relationships that we have with each other, with anybody that we're in a relationship with. And that's actually a beautiful note for me to finish off on. It's lovely to be in this relationship with all of you. And
what a segue, what a segue.
I thank you for joining me this evening. And yes, the last word will go to Izzy Gross.
I want a last word before he does. I thank you very much for pointing out this book. It was a real eye-opener. And
my pleasure.
The knowledge, the loss, I
appreciate that. Thank you. And Izzy, you'll have to take yourself off of mute again. You're on mute, Izzy. No? Okay, we can't hear you. So I'll, with your permission, Izzy, we'll leave it there. And let me wrap this up and bring it to a close. I hope that you enjoyed reading the book. Hope you enjoyed this evening. If you haven't yet read the book, I heartily recommend it. And you know what? Please God, let's do this again. We don't necessarily need to give a pandemic before I give a book review. I'll have to find another book. Maybe we'll take some suggestions. Give me a book that you think would be interesting for me to review. I can't say yes to every book, but maybe we'll do this again in the shorter future, sooner rather than later. Okay, lovely to see you. Stay healthy, stay well, keep washing your hands, wear your masks. We will overcome, and we are getting through this. The vaccine is around the corner. We are getting through this. Be well, everybody. Have a great evening. Bye, everyone.